Welcome to the Hearth Matters podcast with me, Erin Zuma, and my co-host, Catherine Lucas-Damer. Our conversation today is with Jim Dalrymple. He's a journalist and a dad who is thinking about the domestic sphere and practical ways to rebuild the village in the 21st century. Catherine and I both really value Jim's perspective as a father who was once hesitant about having children, but has now embraced the leadership and collaboration required to build a family and a community. And he writes beautifully about these topics on his Substack called Nuclear Meltdown. Jim and I also share a background in the real estate industry, so I got a particular kick out of his take on housing as it relates to family formation. Overall, we had such fun with this one, and I'm sure you will too. Enjoy.
Hi, Jim.
Hey,
Hey, Jim.
So you're a father and a journalist who covers the housing market by day, and you write about parenting and family life and the need for a shift towards village models on your Substack, Nuclear Meltdown. We know you're referring to the meltdown of the nuclear family, and I think there's a lot of confusion about this term. Some think the term nuclear family is negative, right? Because it's too insular and isolated from the pre-industrial village family model. And others think of the term positively. What do you mean when you talk about nuclear family and the melting down?
yeah, it's a great question, and I think that even my own thinking since I've started the Substack and writing about this topic has kind of evolved. But I think that the simplest way to think about it is, for me, is this idea that the family is isolated, this sort of single unit that lives in a single house by itself. The mom and dad are basically doing all of the roles and that kind of thing. Sort of the default way we've been thinking about the nuclear family for like the last half century, maybe a century. That's not to say that there's not room for the nuclear unit. I mean, that unit has existed in some form or another for thousands of years, right? You look like medieval England or ancient Rome or something like that. And there were like moms and dads living with kids. But the difference was that those nuclear units weren't quite so nuclear, right? They weren't so much in isolation. And so I'm not trying to argue that we should completely abolish families. There are people who think that. It's an interesting argument. I disagree with it, but there are people who think that that is a good idea. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm just saying that the nuclear unit shouldn't be so isolated, that we need a bunch of nuclear units. Think of it almost like an atom, right? You have a whole bunch of atoms that come together to form different molecules and that kind of thing. And that's kind of the idea that the nuclear family is not enough for a lot of us.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it was an experiment that you're saying has fallen short of delivering sort of a white picket fence utopia.
Right. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are embedded into this idea of the nuclear family. It implies, for example, the types of relationships we should be having. For example, like that husbands and wives or spouses should be bound by emotional bonds primarily, right? But that was not always the case. That like in the past, there were people who felt that, and still today in many parts of the world, but in the West in the past, there were a lot of people who felt like a marriage was, I don't want to say a union, but in some ways, yes, a practical union, an economic union, as sort of two people striving for some particular goal. And a lot of that stuff, as we moved to this kind of isolated nuclear conceptualization of the family, a lot of that stuff was left behind. And it may be in some cases that's good, but I think that there's maybe some wisdom in the way we used to think about families.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're writing about a really interesting and relevant cross section of subjects that I think are really out there in the zeitgeist. So that is, on the one hand, how do we recreate the village? And then on the other is the practical aspect of housing. So what got you into all of this in terms of starting a Substack and writing about all things parenting, family life, village living?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of a confluence of factors. I was sort of a housing nerd for a long time. I first started kind of following housing and urban development issues years ago when I was just out of college and I was living in a neighborhood and there was sort of a a blow up in the neighborhood over parking. And I started researching, like how does sort of, how do these design issues in cities, how do those issues impact our quality of life and that kind of thing? That was sort of became an interest over the years. And then in 2018, my wife and I, after many years of delaying, finally had our first kid. And I realized that we didn't have like the support network that we needed. And it was sort of like two light bulbs going off or two wires crossing at the same time, right? So it was like, hey, there's this housing stuff that I've been reading about for years. And at the same time, we're too nuclear, right? We're too isolated.
Mhm.
And so I started thinking a lot about that and how those two things intersected with each other. And that kind of led me down the path where you start to look at how did people have support networks in the past while they lived in literal villages. And a village is a collection of people, but there's also design elements, right? That like you can go to old medieval cities in Europe, or you can go to like a sort of improvised favela in Rio de Janeiro, or you can go to Mesa Verde in Colorado, and you see similar elements to these built environments. And it occurred to me that there was an intersection between the way people built the sort of emotional and psychological support systems in their lives and with the way the built environment worked. And so that kind of led me to writing about housing and that kind of thing, and also writing about this other stuff. My writing is sort of in different venues. I'm not doing a lot of housing writing or a lot of family writing in the same places, but I think
Mhm.
there is a strong connection between the way we live and how isolated we are. There's a loneliness epidemic, right? And I think that has to do with how we think about relationships, but it also has to do with how we physically live in our built environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, many of our, especially cities, west of the Mississippi, are built around automobiles.
Right.
And some of the East Coast cities are a little bit more livable in that they're walkable.
Yeah.
And you've got the sweet little small grocery store on every other corner, and that certainly has shifted in modern culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
you say that and it occurs to me, my wife for a while worked for an airline almost exclusively so we could get travel benefits and travel.
Nice.
And we spent, became like a thing that we did. And so we were very, very fortunate, very lucky to like be able to travel. But we went and we would visit like a little town in Spain or something like that. And you go in the evening to the little square and it's ringed by housing, somewhat more dense than single family housing, but not like Manhattan level density, like kind of like 3-story buildings. And then you go out in the square in the evening and there's a bunch of kids playing and there's their grandparents kind of doing a little walk around the square, and there's families at the little cafes. And there is literally nothing like that in my city or any of the cities I've visited, as you say, in the West. And I think that again, there is an intersection. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about housing and the built environment, but I think there is an intersection where to have a supportive village, to have the kinds of support networks that benefit people, you have to interact with people. You have to have a place for that to happen.
Mhm.
And I think old world cities across the whole old world do a really good job of that. I think in the American West, our cities are young enough that we haven't quite figured it out to our detriment.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it really interesting that in traditional cultures, men are often the group of people most concerned with things like protection of the family, of the village, and housing in the physical sense. And then women are more often associated with making a home. And of course, there are plenty of exceptions. And I'm wondering, how do you see this playing out in modern life?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that a lot of guys today are sort of floundering a little bit. Like they're like you see a lot of discussion of masculinity that's really I mean, I feel like the phrase toxic masculinity is overused at this point, but I can't think of another way to put it, right? You see these guys who are like telling young men, take testosterone, get huge, go get famous on Instagram, sleep with a lot of women, go out and sort of these are the goals of life, right? And I think that there are a lot of guys who maybe buy into that to some extent and then end up with sort of lacking a sense of purpose, right? And I know for me, found a huge sense of purpose in becoming a dad, right? Like I had a lovely life before that. I was a reporter on breaking news stories. So I was going all over the place, covering exciting stuff, but nothing really compared to like this sense of purpose that I got from being a dad and realizing that I was living my life for more than just myself. And so I think a lot of guys would benefit from sort of turning away from this kind of like version of masculinity where it's just focused on the self and coming to realize that you can be the leader of a family, right? Maybe the co-leader with your spouse or whatever. We don't have to have like sort of a old school patriarchy or anything like that. But like you 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 can, I guess the question was like this old idea of like men protecting women building a house. Like I think men should, there's room for that. You can be a breadwinner or you can be a co-breadwinner or whatever. You can still protect your family. And I think that that idea maybe would be a better version of masculinity than what we're seeing a lot of the most prominent voices who speak to young men, what they're saying. And it's sort of not that.
Right. And maybe they would feel that sense of purpose that you're talking about if we named it a little bit more specifically. If
Yeah.
fathers taught their sons, hey, one day you're going to build a house or rent a house or manage a house of your own, the physical aspects, and this is what you need to know. I don't know. Some people would accuse me of being too old fashioned there, but I think just like a lot of women, I notice young women don't know how to cook. They don't know
Yeah.
how to do basic things around the house that was just sort of a given in my generation. And I see that with young men who just don't have basic skills around how to take care of a house physically. And
Yeah.
so I just think there's something there that, maybe also when we lost home economics, I think it's taught in some places, but feminists went after home economics as being
Yeah.
sexist and too gendered and all that business. But along with its loss, we lost a lot of life skills. And I could just see young men being really motivated by having that, by naming it, and by having a skill set that they could be proud of, that they could contribute to a family unit.
I mean, I 100% agree. I think I don't know if I've ever like put this in writing, but I have kind of in casual conversations with friends. It's almost like see yourself as the CEO of your family, right? And if you don't have a family yet, see yourself as an early stage entrepreneur who's
Yeah.
trying to found your company, right? And I don't want to like over copy the language of Silicon Valley into the family. Like I don't, I'm not trying to turn it into a business, but I think if you can still protect your family, right? Like may it's not from predators in the night, but it's from a lack of shelter or a lack of food or, you mentioned like doing things around the house. I'm in the middle actually of remodeling part of my house and nights and weekends. It's like going to be like a 6-month project. But
Yeah.
the way I actually learned how to do those skills, it was in my mid to late 30s. I didn't know how to do a single thing until then. And it was because my wife's uncle, who had spent a career in construction, came and lived with us for 2 months and I worked alongside him. And I think it's a really important experience where I had a guy who was like in my village, right? And he came up, an older man came up and he taught me how to do this stuff that has enabled me to take better care of my family. And I think like that should be an experience most guys have, either through shop class or whatever, and also I say guys because speaking here as a guy, but like my wife was actually in that room also learning a lot of that construction stuff too. So it doesn't have to be exclusively guys, but if we're talking about how guys in this world can be better dads or be just more fulfilled, this kind of stuff, this is the kind of stuff that they should have the opportunity to experience with them.
Right.
Right.
Practical skills.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you say you don't want to over professionalize family building, but I think for us millennials and Gen Z, like that's the right angle. Most of us do not find purpose and meaning in our work. Like if we're lucky, we get
Yeah.
to do something fun. But I spent a decade, all of my 20s, looking for a job that was going to make me feel fulfilled. And I wrapped so much of my own identity up in my job title. And then when this motherhood instinct hit me. It was like, oh, wait a second. Building a family is a big project and a big responsibility that can bring with it a lot of rewarding, purposeful, meaningful, projects within the bigger project. And so I think that the way you framed it as become the CEO of your family is a really compelling message for the generations that are coming up, really.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
I
think
love how you put, like you mentioned, like this motherhood instinct kicked in, and it reminds me of like I am super fortunate because I do have a career that I enjoy and I like, but I think it was in 2015, I was at BuzzFeed News in the news division, not the listicle division, but they sent me to Paris to cover the Paris climate talks. And I mean, this was an incredible opportunity, right? Like it was just like a guy, a nobody from nowhere. I'm going to Paris to hobnob with world diplomats. Like I just could not even believe that I was having this opportunity. And I remember at that event, I was walking around Paris, sort of in awe of what was happening, but also feeling like there was still something missing, right? Like at the pinnacle of my experience, the best professional experience I had, I still like it hadn't given me the sort of sense of fulfillment and accomplishment that I thought that it was going to. And I'm still super grateful for that and for all of the like work that I've done since professionally. But I agree. I agree that like your work it's never going to be maybe enough for most people. And for a lot of people, it's not even close to enough, right? Like every day there's like sort of a debate online about how much everybody hates their jobs, right? Like there's plenty of us, and I wouldn't count myself in this group. Like there's plenty of people who are not finding satisfaction in work. And I've been in that boat, and I think a lot of people are. And I think for me, the missing piece was family. Like I didn't know it at the time, and I spent several more years sort of grappling for something, and it's family ended up being it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit. So, in a recent post of yours, you wrote, it doesn't matter how much I study actual villages or traditional parenting. I just cannot copy and paste that experience into my own world. I'm trying to right now, and it's not working. So this is back on the topic of
Yeah.
villages. Give us a little more context. Like, I think it's a really relatable statement, but what have you tried in terms of recreating your own village and what has worked, what hasn't worked? Say more here.
Yeah, it's cut me off because I could talk about this all day. So if I ramble on too long, let me know. But yeah, I made like a lot of big changes. My my wife and I together made a lot of big changes in our lives as we both, I think, started to come to the realization that we needed more than just our little nuclear unit. So things that did work, we were living in LA at the time. We had a little tiny house in East Hollywood, and we had just had our first kid, and we found that we were isolated. And so we decided it was also like the roughest street in East Hollywood. There was just a lot of crime. We couldn't really let our kid play outside. So we decided we needed to move. And I had gotten recently a remote job, so we could literally move anywhere in the world. And we looked, it was very tempting. We looked at some American cities like the Pacific Northwest, which we both absolutely love. The East Coast, Miami, brands. Like we were looking all over, but we eventually settled on Salt Lake because that happens to be where the highest concentration of our family
mm,
was. I come from a huge family, and a lot of them were in the Salt Lake metro area. So we moved to Salt Lake, and then we kind of started quietly encouraging everybody else in our family to move closer. And over the course of of a couple of years, I ended up having three sisters, probably not just because we encouraged them to do this, but for a variety of reasons. They moved close. They're all within a mile of our house. My wife had a brother who moved two doors down from us. And so some of these things did work, right? Like, so we have a lot of family, like right around us, and we see them often. A significant part of my social circle is family, and that now kind of like friends of those family have started to come to events. So they're now my friends. It is a long time ago. I wrote that I don't know that we'll all be able to build a real village, but maybe the closest we could get is kind of what you see like in Modern Family, the sitcom. I think we
Okay.
kind of are like there, right? Like, I think that's maybe what we've achieved, right? This sort of close knit family that we're always seeing each other. It's great. Um, that said, we don't have anyone in the lives of our kids who's like an allo parent. I don't know if everyone is super familiar with that term. I was not until I started
I'm not.
studying this, but an allo parent is basically just, it's kind of a term for what everyone used to have. Like people who are not the parents of kids, but are like performing parenting type duties. It
Mm.
could be a grandparent, it could be a friend, it could be an aunt or an uncle, but basically who are taking on some of the caregiving and child rearing duties. And I think it's because everybody in this little village of ours, we all have full-time jobs. We all sort of are on our kind of individualist life progression. And so it's just a lot of us don't have time. I mean, I would put myself in this boat with my siblings' kids also, that I'm not really helping raise their kids. They come over for dinner, every other week or something like that. And I hang out with them. But um the level of support is limited, and I think it's because, again, we're very busy. Because I came to this idea as an adult, and it's difficult to persuade your fellow adults to kind of get on board with this sort of totally new ideological framework, right? Like I constantly harp on like this idea of building a village to my siblings, and I think that
Mhm.
they are on board, but they're not full converts, to the idea. So it's the village has worked in the sense that our social lives are more robust. Loneliness is not as big of an issue, but it's not like we're really offering much material support to each other. One of the most popular posts I ever wrote was years ago on my blog about a friend who she lives in basically a family compound. Her dad bought a big plot of land like decades and decades ago, built a house there. And then as the kids' generation, my generation, so my friend's generation grew up, those kids bought little pieces of that land and built their own houses.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what I want. And that's what we don't have. Right. So the kids in that little family compound are always running around to each other. If the parents need to go run an errand, the kids just run next door. It's a very, I mean, I'm sure there's challenges, but in my mind, it's a very idyllic situation. And I think a key to that was that it began not with my friend, but with her father, that he started in one generation and he didn't have the village in his generation. His siblings did not live by him. His parents do not live in this compound. But he started this little compound, and it has now taken one generation to turn into the village.
Mhm.
And I think you see that a lot. Like you see that it takes a little while to build this. People who have these support networks, it can take a whole lifetime to build them up. And so I think like, again, to kind of borrow the language of business, there's sort of like in business, you can have like a vertically integrated company or horizontally integrated or vertically integrated. And to sort of use that as a metaphor, I think that my friend's family was vertically integrated across multiple generations. So parents, kids, now grandkids, and they've all sort of worked together to create this village. In my family, we're now trying to do like this horizontal integration where a bunch of people of the same generation are trying to kind of come together,
Yeah.
but it's tough. We're already on different paths and it's hard to bring them all back together. And I am not sure how successful it can even be. Um, So yeah, I mean, I guess like it's an experiment. It's not over yet, right? Like a year from now, I may have a different answer to this question. That's kind of where we're at now.
Yeah, I love this idea of family compounds. I lived in Germany for a number of years, and uh, my husband's family had a four-story home in the west part of Stuttgart, and three of the five boys lived. We each had our own, uh, floor.
No, wow.
And we had Sunday was just standard family day. Everybody
Oh,
showed up on Sunday for the family meal. It's just so much it was then, this is a few years ago, quite a few years ago, 1998, I left Germany. But the family thing was so intact there. No stores are open on Sunday. It's just
right.
everybody, the whole community agreed, "Hey, this is the sort of life that we value." And then now I live in the Santa Cruz Mountains on about 6 acres, and we have 4 families who live here.
I love it.
And unfortunately, my son doesn't live here. I wish that he did, because then it would be partially a family compound. But we have a retired quantum physicist here. He's an elder. He's 87, so we all pitch in and we help him. And then we've got like a young PhD student here, and we've got an entrepreneurial couple who work from home in their house, and so we all have our own private space, but we see each other out on the land. We all work in the
Yeah.
gardens together, or we all help blow off the leaves, or whatever needs to be done. Right now, we've been installing a generator, so everybody kind of pitches in and helps a little bit. So it's pretty great, but it's not an intentional community, And I'm wondering, before we transition into some other stuff. What do you think of intentional communities where friends come together? Ours is more informal. We own the property and we rent out. These are rentals that we have
Yeah.
here on the property. I'm also curious what you think, if you've researched charter cities, and what you think of those. And then we can jump into, more family stuff and fatherhood and that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
I might pass on the charter cities. I haven't done a lot of research. I mean, I've had conversations about this with people, but I would probably not be the expert to weigh in on this. But I do think that, I mean, I think that like the compound or the land that you described, I mean, first of all, I'm super envious. It sounds really awesome. But I also think that I guess I think two things. I think there is a benefit for having a group of people who have come together in an intentional way with whatever level of formality that is, where you have some shared values and you've decided to work together to with a common goal in mind. There is some value in that, but also when if you think of like a traditional village, right? Most people would live in a village not because they selected that village from among many options, but just because they were born there, right? And so I think it can work both ways, I guess, is my takeaway here. That I think that it would be interesting, I guess, to like sort of look at the data on this, like groups that have kind of come together informally versus those who have set up something more official, like who has the better success rate. And I don't know actually, but I think that one thing that comes to mind as I think about this is when I was living in Los Angeles and I'll stop talking about housing after this, but I lived in a little community they call them in LA bungalow courts. And what this is like you have like basically a lot of land, a parcel where normally you'd have a house kind of facing out toward the street, just one house. Imagine taking that house, shrinking it down a little bit and turning it 90 degrees. So it's facing side, and then you do 2 rows of houses kind of facing each other, 2 rows of little houses. And so you have a little courtyard.
Mm.
And it was really a transformative experience for us because it forced you to walk almost through the yards of your neighbors to get to your own house. And it created this common communal space that we were always interacting with. And because of that, our relationships with these neighbors were much stronger than even now live in a more traditional single family house. And I've lived there longer now than I lived in this bungalow court, but I knew the bungalow court
Mm.
neighbors better and than my neighbors now. And these neighbors were not an intentional community at all, right? Like it was a bunch of people who came together because that was the house they could afford. I think there was like 6 different nationalities in this little bungalow fort. People ranging from like early 20s to early 80s. It was a huge range of people, but it was kind of a community. And it was really just because we interacted with each other a lot. So I think to circle back to the question, I think intentional communities are really cool. And if you could find that world, if I could find it, I would probably dive into that. But I also think that for the people who can't find it, hope is not lost, right? Like you can find these communities, even if you can't find kind of the right pieces of the puzzle to fit into the right situation, I guess. It's kind of how it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, intentional communities in the sort of traditional sense from the 60s and 70s. And, we've had a lot of them around here. I've seen them come and go. They don't work that well in the long run. Some do, because there's just so much responsibility. You got to have like, it's every Tuesday night you have to be there for the meeting, and then there are all these personalities that get in the way 'cause they have
Right.
flat hierarchies, and it's
Right.
a little problematic, and in some way, our situation works here well because, we're at the top of the hierarchy chain, and I know that sounds terrible because we're really fair. We always whenever we're bringing a new tenant in, we always check with the entire community to make sure it really is a fit. We're good stewards in that way, but in some ways it is somebody has to be making the decisions. And so
Right.
like this bungalow village idea is just really cool because everybody's autonomous in
Right.
their own, they're making their own family decisions about what works for them, but then when they step outside, they're, interacting with each other.
Yeah.
And, one of our ideas is, for one of the initiatives of our nonprofit is this idea of a domestic economy. And I think to take it a step further beyond just sort of interacting with each other out on the street is to start doing commerce with each other, and we think that that's a really great way to start building these neighbor to neighbor networks where you can buy goods and services from each other. And that
Yeah.
starts to move towards this more traditional pre-industrial village of interdependence, and also allows for homemakers or householders, whoever, whether it's the man or the woman, whoever's doing it, to possibly make a living from home, so they can make
Exactly.
a living while making home. And do you think? Do you see that as part of the village model in your mind? And do you think there's a demand for something like this in the near future?
I do. Yeah, absolutely. As you were talking, it occurred to me that I recalled the sort of intentional community experiments, not of like the 60s, but of like the mid 1800s, like the transcendentalists, right? And like Brook
Right.
Farm and stuff like that. And my understanding is a lot of those failed because it was a bunch of like nerds like me who wanted to just sit around and think all the time and didn't want to actually farm. But I think the reason I bring this up is because it was supposed to be a farm, right? They were supposed to be producing something. And it seems like a lot of the experiments at that time and probably later in intentional communities or in community building have maybe failed because uh, people forgot about the economic component, right? I think that's a huge missing part in the village that I have now that like everyone in my family is just sort of a wage laborer on their own little ship floating through the ocean. The families that I know that are able to build sort of family villages, a lot of times they have a family business, right? They're all in real estate or they're all plumbers. Like my window guy that just installed new windows in my house, he works with his son. And that's not available to everybody, but like the lesson, the takeaway here from these transcendentalist experiments and from these communities that I see now is there is often an economic component to them. But binding yourself to other people just with your sense of friendship or camaraderie is fine, but it's a weak bond. If you have to make peace with people because your livelihood in some part depends on it, you're likely to have a stronger connection to them. You're going to have more reasons to interact with them. And like if you're selling goods to someone, whether they're a Trump or a Biden supporter, or whatever they feel on some issue, you're gonna put those kind of little the differences of opinions maybe aside, and you're going to forge the community. So I absolutely think there's room and a need for more communities to have some sort of economic component. And I love what you guys are doing. It's such a cool idea to start with this as a building block for the community. I think so that's why so many fail is that they don't have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You made a
Yeah.
comment earlier about how nobody in your village has the time to meaningfully care for other members of the village,
Yeah.
whether or not they want to. It because they're all living their lives. They're already immersed in their careers and what have you. And we had someone on earlier this week named Ivana Greco. I don't know if you're familiar
Oh
with
yeah.
her work,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. I haven't met her in person, but I read her all the time. So
yeah,
yes.
she's wonderful,
Yeah.
and she was describing the time that she and other homemakers in her community have, that's really not something that can be replicated if you do have a community of families where everybody's out working, right? Like it's
Right.
just we have finite resources to offer. So that the economic interdependence is really sort of a key that it
Yeah.
would enable a percentage of a given village to really be in the village, to be
Yeah.
providing childcare or providing food services so that the folks that are working in the market economy, because we need that too. We need their productivity there. We
Right.
need
Right.
people to be earning, high dollar amounts, frankly, be able to afford the housing that we want, that those can all sort of coexist within this idea for the domestic economy.
Yeah. I think, so many thoughts come to mind there. We were talking just a second ago about like leadership also in these groups. And it occurs to me in my kind of like family group here, my wife is the only one who doesn't have a conventional sort of wage labor type of job. She has things that she does that are jobs and that earn money, but she's it. I don't want to call her stay at home mom because she's often not at home. She's often out doing stuff, but she has the greatest flexibility of time
Mhm.
and in our sort of broader family group. And what that has meant is she's actually just become the leader of the family by default.
Mhm.
She has the time and the flexibility to occupy that role. And it wasn't something she sought to take on
Yeah.
herself, but it's something that she sort of ended up being. Which is funny because it's mostly my family members, but she's still kind of the leader.
Jim, you call
Yeah.
this kin keeping, right?
Yes, yes.
It's a
Def
beautiful term.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't come up with it, other people came up with it,
Yeah.
but, yeah, she's the kinkeeper of our family, right? And I think like that like you need someone in that role, and it's like in vogue right now to sort of to be kind of against hierarchies and against leadership. I mean, going back to all the way like the Occupy movement, it was like leadership and leaderless and a lot of subsequent movements. And like, we don't have someone telling us what to do. I think you do need that. I think you do need someone to call the shots. And I mean, it's not like they're the masters of everybody, but you need someone to pull everybody together. And I think that becomes doubly true if you have kind of intertwined economic interests, right? Like the window guy that I mentioned a second ago, who puts windows in, he works with his son. It's a family business, but like they're still a boss, right? And I don't know how they particularly negotiate that, when they're having dinner or not in a work context. But I think you do need people in different roles. It can't just be everybody like Brook Farm, the transcendentalists in the 1800s. Everybody's writing poetry and nobody's plowing the field. Someone's got to go out and plow the field,
Yeah.
you know?
Well, I loved that essay that you wrote. You wrote 2 essays on kin keeping about leadership and then also the economics. And it got me to thinking about my mother, who was our kin keeper for sure. And she kept one of her jobs that we never called it a job, but now looking back, it really was. We were pretty spread out around the country. And so she kept connections alive with family members and cousins. And when she died, it all went away with her.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that sad? My sister and I didn't pick up the baton. My mother never said to me, "This is a job. And
Yeah.
you're now the eldest daughter, and you probably have the most time, and you're probably the most organized. And this is your responsibility to take forward." And I just love that you're naming it and writing about it. And I wonder if, part of the reason we don't value it more in our culture is because we haven't named it, but also because it's not waged work. Like we run everything through the lens of the market economy. And because it's not waged, we don't value it or think about it. Do you think there's a connection there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a huge debate in sort of a lot of the circles that I think you guys are engaging with right now is that how do we value sort of the domestic sphere, right? Like there's a
Yeah.
lot of women and men who are doing tasks in the domestic world, and those have a huge amount of value, right? But they're not like you don't get a W-2 for, being a homemaker. And kin keeping is one of those tasks, child rearing, all of these sorts of things. So
Cooking.
yeah, I think that there is a challenge with sort of quantifying and understanding that these are jobs. But I also think that labeling them does help. I mean, I know I discovered the concept of kinkeeping through the course of writing and reporting on this stuff. Like I did, 5 years ago, I had not heard that term before. But now that I have, and now that I think it's an important concept, my wife and I will like sit around. We'll be like, oh, should we host a family dinner this weekend? And it's a huge ordeal. Like there's like 30 people who come to our house when we have a family dinner. It's a major undertaking. And so we'll sometimes be like, oh man, I don't know. Like we have to clean up the whole house. We have to make a ton of food. But there have been several occasions where my wife is like, but you know what? It's our job to be kinkeepers. We
Yeah.
need to do this because we need to make sure it's what happens. And so knowing that, understanding that that is a role that you can take on and do a good or a bad job at has actually just that knowledge has made a difference for us.
Mhm.
And maybe
Yeah.
even your family recognizing it, your community valuing it,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
I mean, my blog is like a public blog, my Substack, but like I'm kind of writing it for my family. Like
Yeah.
every time I publish a post, like the next day we'll have a dessert night and the people who want to discuss will sort of sit around later than everybody else and we'll debate it and they'll tell me all the ways I'm wrong. But but yeah, like they know about it too, right? So everyone in this little kind of like budding village understands that these are ideas and it does make a difference. It doesn't solve all the problems, but I think it does kind of nudge you in a direction of having stronger bonds. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that Catherine and I spoke about early on after we met was that once you see the domestic sphere or once you see a role like kinkeeper, like once
Yeah.
you've named it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And I
Totally.
think so much of our culture just overlooks our responsibilities to our home and to our family. And so all of our attention is focused on the things we can buy, the places we can travel, and what we're doing with our career. What's the next promotion? And so, yeah, for me, I think what you're both saying is that once you name it, you really take it seriously. And that
Yeah.
is true of the entirety of the domestic sphere for me.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to make this stuff a priority. I think if you can't talk about it, right? Like one of the things, and I've written about this too on a few different occasions. So sorry if I'm kind of rehashing stuff, but like one of the like mental shifts that I've tried to make, some success and some not, but like is trying to when I have a choice to make, saying like, is this going to benefit me or is this going to benefit the family? What impact does this have on my community of people in my life? But it's hard to even articulate that question if you don't have a way to speak about that group, right? If I didn't know about kinkeeping, or if I just hadn't kind of labeled this community of people a village, like it would be difficult to say, like, how do I prioritize this group when the group isn't a thing? It's,
Right.
I think a lot of people are doing more work on this than me, but coming up with the terminology to describe the value that all of these other roles have is such good work that needs to be done.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, one of the reasons that we were really interested in having you on, Jim, is because you are a man and you are a father. Because we talk about family life and motherhood from a woman's perspective. So, I want
Yeah.
to kind of ask an open ended question because I don't think Catherine and I feel like men are given the same microphone when it comes to talking about fatherhood. So, the open ended question is, what's it like?
Good. Good. That's all I'll say. No. No, I mean, being a dad, I was really reluctant to become a dad. My wife and I got married when I was 25 and we did not have our first kid until I was 36. So we went 11 years and that was almost entirely because of me. My wife was ready to have kids long before I was. And I was just really worried that being a dad would ruin my life, right? Like
Mhm.
the night before my first daughter was born, I was like, this is my last night of freedom. I didn't like go do anything. I was sitting by my wife waiting in case we had to go to the hospital. But I was like, I'm about to go to prison for 18 years. I was really worried. I just, cause like I had a fun life. Like I mentioned going to Paris, I was doing all this stuff. I had a job at a place that at that time was like, kind of buzzy. People, you'd say that at a party, be like, oh, wow, it's a cool job. And I was just worried that I was going to lose all of that. And instead, I mean, I did lose some of that, right? Like I'm not traveling as much for work and stuff, but the trade-offs have been just overwhelmingly positive. And I know not everybody feels this way. And I know there's like a huge debate about mental health, especially with moms. And I don't want to like, minimize that in any way. But for me personally, becoming a parent has just, the trade-offs were so overwhelmingly positive that I want to talk to more guys about that, because I think it was a mistake for me to wait so long and for me to kind of drift through the world, to go to Paris and be like, what am I missing here? And it was obvious what I was missing. And I think I hope fewer guys make that mistake. There's like this debate, I guess, this comes to mind, like about what women ought to be doing, right? Like, should women have a career? Should they be raising kids? Like what? And like, I'm not here to talk about what women should be doing. Like that's personal choice, but like, we don't have that conversation with dads, right? Like
Mhm.
no one when I was like in college came to my class of a bunch of dudes and was like, hey, you guys, don't have kids, get a career, or vice versa. Hey, you guys, don't have a career, have kids. Like we never talked to men about the trade-offs of fatherhood versus career, or that kind of thing. And maybe for a lot of guys, they're a little bit different than the trade-offs that some women have to make. But you do come to crossroads in your life where there are trade-offs to be made. And I think the trade-offs, the things you lose by becoming a dad, are not as big a deal as the things you gain. And I think we should have a more of a conversation with men about this, that like being a dad is not for everybody, for a lot of guys, probably going to be the best thing you do, right?
Right.
You might rise up and be the CEO of some billion-dollar company, but and through my job, I interview a lot of those guys. And a lot of the time they'll be like, you know what? The thing that matters most to me is my kids.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's just me. I think there's a lot of men who find great meaning in fatherhood, and just these like little moments, right? Just like earlier today, I was throwing my kids into a beanbag chair, and it seemed like it would hurt. Like now they've been thrown 3 feet through the air. They just love it. They just keep coming back and back and back. And if you told me before I was a dad that would be the highlight of my day, I would have been like, oh my gosh, that sounds awesome.
Right.
What's the rest of your day look like? But now knowing like it's fun. They have this way of experiencing joy that transfers, I think, to me as a dad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about, this shift from the agrarian era into the industrial era, and men were the first ones to be displaced from their homes
Yeah.
and pushed into the public sphere. And now they're away from the family for 150 years or longer. And
Yeah.
I think as we, move into the digital age and men can work more from home, Aaron's husband also does some work from home, that we have the potential, I hope anyway, to see this real shift where men do embrace fatherhood in a new way. They're not as isolated from the family.
Yeah.
And it's really heartwarming to hear you talk about fatherhood in this way.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I work from home. There's pros and cons, right? They all got out of the house today, so I could do this call, which is like, which is fine. Like they do that every day. They're like at the park playing. They love it. So there's pros and cons. Like, you have sort of space conflicts sometimes where a lot
Yeah.
of my job involves making phone calls to people and talking to them, interviewing. And so I don't want to like paint it as entirely rosy, but it's also amazing. I do, I make my kid breakfast every morning. I'm there when they have lunch. My daughter is in kindergarten. She gets home. I'm home, to see her. And it is really great to just be in their lives that much. In some ways, I wish that we were kind of running a family farm or something so that they would be working alongside me. They can't really interview the head of some real estate company, which is what I do a lot for my work. But even without that, just being around, I think makes a big difference.
Yeah.
I'm super fortunate. So not everyone can do that.
On the one hand, you have the gender war is really heating up. And I think a lot of, unfortunately, feminist narratives point out the shortcomings of men. On the other hand, millennial men, I think certainly more than my father, who's in his 50s, are present and like primed to be amazing fathers. So I find it such a shame when I hear women disparaging men, in large swaths and just, really, really hating on the dudes because from my perspective, like we got a good thing going in terms of the way that work life is shaping up, giving
Yeah.
men more opportunity to be at home. And then, our culture really asking them to be present and heavy participants in raising their children. And so like I feel very, very fortunate. I see that in my own husband. It sounds like you have that in your family. So that being said,
Yeah.
so you mentioned not want you didn't start sooner and you sort of talked about why, but if you could go back and talk to your 25-year-old self, what do you think that you could say to that 25-year-old self that would be compelling? Because
Hmm.
I haven't. I'm due in 2 months with our first, and the hesitation that like that last night before
Right.
the fun 18-year clock starts, like
Yep.
that is definitely a present feeling. Like
Oh yeah.
being a dink, double income, no kids, and a dog is really, really fun.
Yeah, it is.
Realize younger people who are having fun, I don't know that I've figured out like the right message to say, "Hey, this family thing is gonna be awesome," and that like
Yeah.
the dink thing will get old at a certain point. So that's a really long-winded way about
Yeah.
it. What would you tell your 25-year-old self? Or
Well, I would say this. I would say, I mean, first of all, I was a really good date, right? Like you often hear like people who like dinks, dual income, no kids. People say like, oh, well, we could just, we can jet off to Paris if we want. But like, then they never do it. But we did it, right? Because my wife worked for an airline. We would go all over the world. We went to Western Europe. We went to Istanbul. We went to Morocco. Like we were good at being dinks, right? We went out to eat all the time. It was great.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is as fun as that is, the other experiences will also be fun, I think. But also, you don't have to give it all up, right? We just took our 3 kids, and my in laws also went with us to Spain in October. And we had to save up a lot longer to do this. We had to kind of travel closer to the ground and do it cheaper. We didn't eat out every night in Spain. We, went to did like a lot of grocery store picnics. But you don't lose all of this stuff when
Mhm.
you have kids. And actually, even before this was just a few months ago, but just like the nights before we left for Spain, I was like, this trip is going to be rough, right? Like we're taking 3 kids, all of them 5 or under, compared to our previous trips where we've just been sort of loosely fancy free doing whatever we want the whole time. Uh, but it was the best trip I think I've ever taken. It was amazing. And seeing, visiting a castle with my 3-year-old son, that it was better than just visiting the castle by myself. You know what I mean? And I think that probably applies to a lot of experiences, not just travel, but, going to see a concert with your kids. Obviously, you're not going to go like Metallica with the 3-year-old, but like there, our city has like concerts in the summer, right? And I would go to them before I had kids and that kind of thing before I had kids. And I still go to them after. And it's so much better to like dance on the dance floor with my 5-year-old daughter. So all of these experiences, like the good stuff stays and it gets better.
Mm.
And some of the things that you lose, maybe there's some nostalgia for that, but a lot of this stuff just, it's not as important, I guess. Like stuff that I was doing on trips or concerts or whatever that I could only do because I didn't have kids. It's not as big a deal.
Mm. Mhm.
So I guess that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I don't think you lose the good stuff. You can
Right.
still do it and it
Yeah.
becomes better.
Yeah,
And,
right.
if you do it young enough, I had my son too young.
Mm.
Culture didn't support it, and
Yeah.
I wasn't emotionally mature enough. But physically, it was the exact right time to have a child. I was
Mm.
20. So
Okay.
by 38, I was free
Right.
and I was young. And I know a lot of women who are 38, thinking about pregnancy. And I think, oh my gosh. So I just want to say, even if you have them at 25 or 30,
Yeah.
I'm in my 60s and I got to tell you, life is fun.
Yeah.
Life is
Yeah.
really fun. So it's like if you're around for 80 or 90 years, committing this 18 years or whatever, to raising kids, it goes by so fast, as you probably already recognizing. And on the other side of it, there's still a lot of fun to be had. Just Just putting the word in.
Yeah. I mean, I am envious. When I am in my 60s, I will still have
Yeah.
kids at home.
Right.
Well, that'll be on the tail end of that. But I mean, when I was born, my grandparents were in their 50s, right? Like they were young and vital and like they could do all sorts of things. That won't necessarily be the case. And I am glad I waited a little while to have kids, but I do think I waited maybe a little too long,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
that said, I'm not unhappy. Like I have a really happy life. So maybe,
Yeah.
Yeah.
who knows?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and the kid will keep you young. That's the other
Yeah.
bit, right? That you get to
Right.
see the world through their eyes and
Oh yeah.
let them drag you to all the places that they're interested in that, you weren't at that age.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like this trip to Spain is a good example of that for us, where it was like we went to all of these kid things that I wouldn't have otherwise even known about, but which were really like kind of authentic travel experiences. Like you want to like experience the local culture when you travel. Well, like travel with a kid and they'll go find other kids. All those kids will be locals and suddenly you'll be in a group of local people there. And it'll like, I didn't really have these kinds of travel experiences without kids.
Totally.
And so like the kids will pull you into new and interesting experiences.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Of course, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is is what I said about fathers being more engaged true? I sort of like made the assumption, but are
Yeah.
you finding that your fellow fathers are as engaged as you are?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't think I'm like, some incredible dad or anything like that. I think I'm pretty typical I'm like the oldest millennial, like the very edge of the millennial generation. I think like most people my age demographic and like younger tends to be more engaged. I think that's a good thing. Yeah. Maybe we'll have this like sort of rising generation. I think it's particularly beneficial for sons. I mean, daughters also, but like I think sons benefit a lot from having
Right.
models of hopefully positive masculinity in their lives. You know, best case scenario, we have like this great generation of sons coming up behind us, right? Who have seen dads be present in their lives and have taught them to be respectful to everyone else around them, that kind of thing. So we'll find out, but I can't imagine there being a lot of downsides to more present fathers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a really important service to society.
Yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, well, all parenting, right? Like
Yeah.
men and women, like both sides, I think, but it's kind of goes back to like this gender divide, right? Where we're like always talking about what women should be doing and rarely talking about like, guys, step it up here, right? Guys, be better, guys, like be models for your sons, that kind of thing. And I kind of knew this because I was like in a community that was like somewhat culturally conservative growing up, but like I think a lot of guys don't ever hear that comment. Like being a good father is a culturally important and socially important thing to do. Well, I think more guys should hear that, and it might persuade them to get their lives in order and do something other than just sort of chasing Instagram likes or something.
Hmm. Hmm.
I was going to ask one more question about housing, but we've talked a lot about it today.
Yeah,
Actually, what the heck? What the heck? Do you think that the lack of affordable housing is a legitimate barrier to family formation, or is it more of a cultural phenomena that reinforces the idea that raising kids is prohibitively expensive? Because this is something that, as a fellow housing nerd, I think a lot about.
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think and it also depends a lot on where you are. If you are in New York City or San Francisco or Washington, D.C. or somewhere like that, it probably is like a legitimate barrier. Those places have huge sort of premiums on their housing. If you are in Grand Rapids, Michigan or Des Moines, Iowa or something like that, like it's probably not. If we look at like the data, like the overall US home ownership rate is actually really constant. It's usually hovering around 2/3, somewhere in the mid 60%. And it'll dip by, a percentage point or two or three or whatever, but it's still in the same general vicinity of where it had been for generations.
Mhm.
And even when you look at millennials, a majority of millennial households are now homeowner households, right? I think that
Mm.
a lot of people don't realize that, but a majority of millennials now are homeowners, or a majority of millennial households. And so I think to some extent, there's like a certain amount of myth that like all millennials or all Gen Z are being priced out of the housing market. It's just, it's so tough. There's another stat that gets like thrown around a lot, which is that millennials and Gen Z are poorer at this stage in their life than previous generations. But that has over the last couple of years flipped actually. Our generation is actually now better off at this particular stage in life than previous generations. I don't think that's really gotten out there as much. So I think there is kind of like a little bit of like this doomerism where it's like, oh, it's so hard. And I think that if you want to make it work, you can, and it might require some sacrifices, like moving to a cheaper city, which a lot of people did during the pandemic. Or if you have the foresight to think about this early enough, choosing a profession in college that's maybe more lucrative or something like that. But so I think there's like a little bit of a myth. I think that if you want to have kids and you want to have a family, that the cost of housing, like a lot of other millennials have made it work, and you probably can too, but it's probably going to require some sacrifices and that kind of thing. So that said, there are places where housing is too expensive, like these big cities. And I do think that if we're looking for policy solutions to help families, we should be building more housing, and we should be building more housing that helps families survive. So more housing just in general. We need to increase the supply significantly. But we also need to be putting that housing in places that families want to live. In my city, in Salt Lake, for example, they've built a massive amount of housing, but it's all these kind of like new apartment complexes, mostly 1 and 2 bedrooms on really busy commercial streets. Not a lot of families want to live on, a 5-lane highway where there's no outdoor space. We need to be putting housing in neighborhoods where a family wants to live, by good schools, on quiet streets. And it's really difficult to do that in large part, partly because of like zoning and regulations, but in large part because existing homeowners don't want that housing there. So my short answer to that question is, I think maybe my generation had bought in a little bit too much to like the pessimistic kind of doom saying, but also we do legitimately need to increase the supply of housing. Like demand is very high and it is creating an imbalance with the supply.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's well said. And I guess as we wrap up, I'm curious about a couple of things. Are you writing a book? You are such a fantastic writer. I just love your Substack.
Thank you
And
so
I
much.
just I want to see it all in a book. I love your perspective. It's wonderful to hear a man talking about fatherhood and housing and all of these issues the way you do.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer for that. I would like to write a book, and I have occasionally like sort of pitched agents on it and talked to friends who have written books. The question, I think like to relate this back to some of the stuff we're talking about is actually like, I would love to write a book for like the sake of my ego, right? But I also, like I constantly am asking myself, like, would any particular endeavor, like what's the impact on my family? Writing a book's a big endeavor. It's a big undertaking. Like,
Right.
is that going to translate into some benefit for my broader village? And it probably would. I think I'm sort of dragging my feet a little bit because I'm not sure. And I like, so yeah, maybe we'll see.
I understand. Also, in the traditional publishing model, it doesn't make sense financially, right? But
Right.
for
Exactly.
independently publishing, it can make sense. And then the people you want to reach, are they reading books? We
Yeah.
ask ourselves that all the time because we want to reach out. We really want to reach younger women,
Yeah.
but they're not necessarily reading books. So, what is the best way to get your message out? And I think right now you're doing just a fantastic job on Substack. And I do hope that we can talk again. It seems like we've just scratched the surface of so many wonderful issues that we're aligned on and complex issues that probably
Yeah.
require some more teasing out that can't happen in an hour conversation. But
Oh yeah.
gosh, we so appreciate your time today and just your good energy. And I'm just so impressed with you. I have to say, I really respect what you're up to, Jim. So thank you
Well,
so much for your time.
the feeling is mutual. I am so glad that we connected, and I also love what you guys are doing. So yeah, I hope we get to talk again. And in the meantime, I will be following very closely
Oh,
what you
great.
guys up to.
We're having your wife on next time. We promise,
Yeah,
right?
she's a smart cookie. You guys would like talking to her.
A
So
kinkeeper.
yeah,
Awesome.
exactly.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much. And we'll talk soon. Bye, everyone.